The Tyrannosaurus Rex, a designation synonymous with omnipotent dominance, a precision-engineered, 9-ton apex predator endowed with a jaw force capable of pulverizing an automobile. Conventionally, we visualize this creature as an invincible sovereign reigning supreme at the pinnacle of the food chain. However, the reality was significantly more harrowing. North America, 66 million years ago, functioned not as a sanctuary, but as a theater of survival, where the demarcation between hunter and target was thinner than a strand of silk. The throne occupied by the T-Rex was never a birthright. It was a position secured through catastrophic injuries and perennial brushes with mortality. From living, armored bastions and leviathans of staggering stature to unseen terrors patrolling the depths, we are reopening the death files today to confront the 6 deadliest adversaries that forced the Dinosaur King to spill its own blood. The inaugural entry on this list of fatal rivals, and arguably the most quintessential, is the Triceratops. I must insist, however, that you immediately purge the docile, sluggish caricature often depicted in children's literature or cinema. Within the unforgiving crucible of the Cretaceous, the Triceratops was not a benign, herbivorous bovine. Rather, visualize a rhinoceros fueled by an overdose of adrenaline, encased in the plating of a main battle tank and possessing the volatile, aggressive disposition of an ancient gladiator. This dynamic represents one of the most hazardous predator-prey relationships in the annals of planetary history. Why such a definitive assertion? Because while the T-Rex necessitated the consumption of flesh for its continued survival, the Triceratops had evolved specifically to liquidate anything that threatened its boundaries. Observe the lethal biological arsenal bestowed upon this creature by nature. Most striking are the dual cranial horns, each exceeding a meter in length. These were not composed of spongy cartilage. They were solid bone, sheathed in a razor-honed, keratinized casing the same organic substance composing eagle talons or human fingernails. Far from being ornamental displays meant to woo potential mates, these were 2 spears of oblivion. 2 sharpened biological broadswords engineered for a solitary purpose to eviscerate the vital organs of any colossal aggressor. To safeguard its vulnerable neck, a massive ossified frill was employed. This structure functioned as more than a physical barrier against spinal bites. It served as a mechanism for psychological warfare when engorged with blood. This frill could shift into vivid warning hues, signaling a looming bloodbath to any encroaching threat for the T-Rex. Attempting to bring down a 9-ton engine of destruction like the Triceratops presented a lethal geometric conundrum. The Tyrannosaurus relied exclusively on its mandibles. It was required to breach the perimeter of the prey's defenses to deliver a decapitating or bone-crushing bite to the hip, spine, or neck. Yet the Triceratops was never a sedentary target. Contemporary biomechanical analyses demonstrate that despite their immense bulk, these creatures possessed a low center of gravity and 4 robust limbs, which facilitated an incredibly rapid pivot. They acted as rotating fortresses, perpetually orienting their horns toward the enemy to maintain an impenetrable wall of iron and spike. A high-stakes gamble was forced upon the T-Rex with every pursuit. It had to devise a method to bait the Triceratops into exposing its flank or tail. A singular miscalculation, a slight stumble on slick substrate, or a millisecond of delayed reflex would likely cost the predator its life. Consider the kinetic energy delivered by a full-force charge from a Triceratops. Those 2-meter horns, fueled by 9 tons of mass and rapid acceleration, generated a piercing force of terrifying magnitude. They were more than capable of puncturing hide, rending muscle, shattering ribs, and driving deep into the cardiac or pulmonary cavities of the T-Rex. In an ecosystem devoid of antibiotics or surgical intervention, a penetrating lung puncture guaranteed a protracted, agonizing demise from sepsis or respiratory failure. Do these scenarios remain merely theoretical? Not at all. Fossilized records provide the bloody receipts of these duels to the death, carved permanently into their very remains. Paleontologists in Montana unearthed a Triceratops pelvic specimen. Imprinted upon the bone are profound lacerations, perfectly matched to the dental architecture of a Tyrannosaurus. Yet, the most astounding detail resides within the evidence of bone regeneration. This indicates that although the T-Rex launched a lethal strike, it failed. The Triceratops rallied, survived the assault, and persisted for years following the encounter. Our sovereign had been defeated and was forced to retreat, nursing an empty belly, and yet there exists even more grisly documentation regarding the perils posed by this herbivore. A Tyrannosaurus Rex skull was once unearthed displaying a perfectly circular perforation directly beneath the eye socket. The dimensions and geometry of this wound correspond precisely to the terminal point of an adult Triceratops horn. It is evident that this specific T-Rex was gored during a head-on engagement, though it was fortunate to survive the injury, having narrowly bypassed the brain. That scar remained a permanent testament to the encounter. Hunting the Triceratops was never a simple banquet. It was a hazardous excursion into a lethal snare. Within the Hell Creek ecosystem of the late Cretaceous, Triceratops represented nearly 40% of the faunal population. Consequently, these encounters were a daily occurrence for the T-Rex. Every surge of hunger necessitated a life-or-death calculation, endure the risk of a thoracic piercing for a potential meal, or abandon the pursuit in favor of a safer opportunity. For the Tyrannosaurus, the Triceratops was never merely quarry. It was a peerless adversary, a kingslayer that imparted the most critical survival mandate: true strength is not found in a streak of uninterrupted victories, but in the wisdom to discern when to commit to combat and when to withdraw. However, if the Triceratops functioned as a gladiator wielding sharp armaments, the next rival presented a far distinct nightmare, a mobile fortress. A stoic, silent, living tank, the Ankylosaurus. This creature represents the pinnacle of defensive artistry achieved over 4 billion years of evolution. While we acknowledge that the Tyrannosaurus possessed the most potent bite force of any terrestrial animal, calculated at 6 tons, or 57,000 newtons, that divine capacity for destruction is rendered pathetically inert when confronted by the Ankylosaurus. Why? Because from the snout to the tail, its entire anatomy is blanketed in hundreds of bony plates known as osteoderms. This is far from a simple thickened hide. Rather, these are dense osseous blocks embedded deep within the dermis, interwoven and overlapping much like Roman military armor or roof shingles. This architecture is not only granite hard, it is sheathed in a resilient keratinous layer, creating a biological composite reminiscent of contemporary Kevlar. It is engineered to be sufficiently rigid to deflect shearing force, yet flexible enough to dissipate kinetic energy. The protection is so comprehensive, it is almost unsettling. Even the eyelids were armored. Upon sensing a threat, the beast merely anchors itself, concealing its limbs and vulnerable underbelly beneath this impenetrable boulder-like shell. An inexperienced T-Rex might foolishly attempt to clamp its jaws upon the creature's dorsal plating, but the outcome is invariably a tragedy for the hunter rather than the prey. The Tyrannosaurus's precious 30-centimeter teeth, highly sensitive pressure sensors, would be subjected to a violent recoil force. Teeth may be fractured, chipped, or shattered to the root, inviting agonizing pain and fatal dental infections. Nevertheless, the primary peril of the Ankylosaurus is not its passive exterior, but its posterior, the zone the T-Rex typically targets to evade observation. Observe the tail. Nature fashioned it into a perfect siege weapon. The terminal 7 vertebrae are fused into a rigid rod, functioning as the handle of a hammer, while a dense, Gnarled mass of bone weighing tens of kilograms serves as the hammerhead. This is not a mere tail. It is a medieval mace propelled by an exceptionally powerful musculature at the base. Biomechanical modeling suggests that a swing velocity of 19 meters per second could be achieved. Never be misled by its sluggish demeanor. When deployed, that tail operates with the snap of a whip. The impact generated at the point of contact possesses the force required to fracture reinforced concrete. Unfortunately for the T-Rex, the trajectory of this strike aligns perfectly with a fatal weak point, its own ankles and shins. In a genuine confrontation, the predator would be required to flip the Ankylosaurus to access its soft belly, necessitating a shove with its snout or limbs. This action forces the T-Rex into the immediate kill zone of that lethal club. The Ankylosaurus needs neither speed nor agility. It merely requires patience. A single successful strike is sufficient. The resulting snap of bone would signify the conclusion of a monarch's reign, as the Tyrannosaurus's tibia or fibula would instantly disintegrate under the immense kinetic load. In the savage Cretaceous wilderness, where medical intervention was non-existent, a broken leg for a 9-ton apex predator constituted an absolute, unappealable death sentence. Unable to forage or hunt, the hunter would collapse, lingering in torment until thirst or starvation claimed it, ultimately becoming a carcass for circling scavengers. Thus, for the T-Rex, the Ankylosaurus remained the most prohibitive meal a gamble where the potential caloric gain was dwarfed by the permanent forfeit of its mobility. Most seasoned T-Rex individuals wisely opted to ignore this living tank, reserving their aggression for the aged, the infirm, or the pathologically desperate. Yet, if these two provided tactical nightmares in close quarters, the subsequent opponent challenged the Dinosaur King on a fundamentally different front. Neither armor nor horns defined this rival. Rather, it was a scale of size so gargantuan that it reduced the predator to the stature of a mere house pet. This was a true colossus, forcing the T-Rex to entirely revise its hunting strategies. Common wisdom dictates that the Tyrannosaurus reigned as the largest terrestrial inhabitant of North America. But that assumption is erroneous. In the twilight of the Cretaceous, while the T-Rex occupied its throne, a specter from the past, a lineage previously presumed to be extinct on the continent, abruptly returned. Migrating from South America, they introduced a terrifying magnitude that rendered the Dinosaur King diminutive. This was the Alamosaurus, the final sign of the Tyrannosaur family. To illustrate the disparity, a robust, mature T-Rex reached a hip height of 4 meters and a mass of 9 tons, yet the Alamosaurus dwarfed even this. This behemoth spanned 30 meters in length, a distance comparable to 3 buses docked end to end. Its neck soared like a construction crane, and its total mass was calculated at between 70 and 80 tons. To conceptualize this, compare a 150-kilogram lioness to a 6-ton African elephant. Now, amplify that disparity to an even more chilling ratio of 1 to 8. When standing in the shadow of an adult Alamosaurus, a T-Rex was reduced to the stature of a mere knee-high pet. Combat was an impossibility. Survival was a matter of total physical subjugation. Alamosaurus required no arsenal of razor-sharp horns like the Triceratops, nor a sophisticated cudgel like the Ankylosaurus. Its sheer, unadulterated mass served as its weapon. A single kinetic strike from those pillar-like limbs could pulverize a T-Rex's ribcage with the ease of crushing an aluminum can. Should it rear up and deliver a downward stomp, the earth would shudder, and any creature beneath those feet would be rendered into pulp. Furthermore, its elongated tail functioned as a gargantuan lash. Physicists suggest that the extremity of a titanosaur's tail could be whipped at velocities exceeding the speed of sound, generating sonic booms capable of rupturing eardrums and inducing soft tissue trauma in anything nearby. What, then, was a T-Rex to do? Would it simply perish from famine while watching an 80-ton walking warehouse of meat wander past? The solution is found in one of the most debated and riveting theories in contemporary paleontology: cooperative pack hunting. The presence of such gargantuan quarry served as the evolutionary catalyst that compelled the T-Rex to modify its social behavior. They were forced to abandon solitary habits in favor of communal dynamics. Visualize a gruesome tableau on the North American plains where a Tyrannosaurus family orchestrates a strike with the precision of a wolf pack. The younger, more agile members, possessing slender profiles and elongated limbs, functioned as the drivers. Their objective was to harry the giant, nipping at its flanks and tail to incite panic, effectively isolating the individual from its protective herd or forcing it into treacherous terrain. Because of their speed, these juveniles could nimbly evade the titan's lethal stomps. Once the prey became exhausted, hemorrhaging, and disoriented, the heavy ordnance would be deployed. The matriarch, the dominant alpha of the pride, would emerge from the brush, rather than targeting the extremities. She would strike the hip or thigh with a 6-ton bite force. She could excise a massive cavern of flesh, shattering the pelvis or severing the femoral artery. This was no swift execution. It was a siege, a brutal war of attrition. They would assault, retreat, bide their time, and then strike again, with infinite patience. They harried the giant until it collapsed from hemorrhaging and systemic fatigue. When an Alamosaurus finally struck the earth, the impact resonated across the horizon. The dividend for their collective labor was a mountain of meat, sufficient to sustain the entire T-Rex lineage for weeks. For the predator, the Alamosaurus was not merely dinner. It was an intellectual litmus test, demonstrating that the Dinosaur King possessed not just raw power, but the cognitive flexibility to realize that individual vigor is hollow. When pitted against the colossal forces of nature, only through unity is survival ensured. Yet, if the Alamosaurus represented a modern challenge of scale, the subsequent rival emerged as a specter from the deep past, an antagonist that haunted the ancestors of the Tyrannosaurus and suppressed their lineage within the shadows for tens of millions of years. We frequently indulge in the fallacy that the T-Rex was born into its crown, arriving on the evolutionary map, already situated at the zenith of biological authority. This, however, is a profound historical deception. In reality, the Tyrannosaurus clan was forced to endure a protracted existence in exile, skulking in obscurity for ages before the throne could finally be claimed. Why was a lineage harboring such latent potential subjected to such prolonged humiliation? The answer is sequestered behind a name few recognize, yet which served as the ultimate nightmare for the early Tyrannosaurus, Siats microrum. Let us recalibrate our clocks to North America between 90 and 100 million years ago. At that juncture, the forerunners of the T-Rex species, like Moros intrepidus, were diminutive, roughly the stature of a large hound or a deer. While gifted with intelligence and agility, they were physically overwhelmed. They occupied the status of second-tier predators or opportunistic scavengers, far removed from the apex of the food chain. The title of the throne was held by Siats during that epoch, borrowed from the mythic man-devouring monster of Ute legend. The name Siats was fittingly earned through sheer brutality. Belonging to the Crocodile family, the gargantuan, shark-toothed lizards, these predators spanned over 10 meters and tipped the scales at 4 tons. In that era, they stood as undeniable titans, while the forerunners of the T-Rex were reduced to diminutive creatures, weighing from a few dozen to a few hundred kilograms. The disparity was comparable to a wolf attempting to challenge a Siberian tiger. Siats did not view the T-Rex lineage as peers. Instead, they were categorized as mere nuisances or, occasionally, light snacks. Ecological suppression is the term paleontologists apply to this phenomenon. Throughout 20 million grueling years, the unchallenged supremacy of Siats erected an impenetrable glass ceiling. The Tyrannosaur bloodline was effectively barred from scaling up. Whenever a population of these early tyrants attempted to expand in size, they were inevitably confronted and mercilessly liquidated by Siats. Meat was not the sole incentive. These monsters slaughtered tyrannosaurs to eradicate the seeds of future rivals. Much like contemporary lions that systematically destroy leopard or hyena cubs to stifle future competition, Siats decimated countless generations of their smaller cousins. One can readily visualize the tragedy: tiny tyrannosaurs living in a state of perpetual terror, forced to hunt under the cover of night, cowering in dense thickets, and fleeing for their lives whenever the seismic thrum of a true tyrant's footsteps approached. The T-Rex's ferocity was forged in that crucible of fear. However, the history of our planet remains cruelly impartial. No dynasty is permitted to reign forever. Around 80 million years ago, the North American climate began to shift. The humid jungles and swamps that served as the preferred habitat for Siats commenced a slow retreat, ultimately yielding to an expanse of arid forests and open plains. This ecological turnover triggered a collapse of the existing food web. Because Siats possessed a bulky physiology and limited adaptive range, they could not weather these environmental transformations. Slowly, they withered, eventually spiraling into total extinction. The throne was vacated, signaling the exact moment the Tyrannosaur lineage had anticipated for 20 million years. With their suppressor vanquished and the glass ceiling shattered, an unprecedented explosion in size was initiated by the T-Rex's ancestors. Within a mere few million years, these tiny beings swelled 10 to 20-fold in mass, evolving into the colossal tanks of flesh that define our modern perception of them. The T-Rex was the ultimate byproduct of that liberation, a manifestation of suppressed energy pent up for eons. Finally erupting with maximal intensity, Siats Mikaron stands as the T-Rex's most formidable rival, not because it triumphed in direct combat, but because it prohibited the Tyrannosaur from even existing for the better part of a geological age. It remains a ghost of history, reminding us that occasionally, one's greatest adversary is not the threat in front of you, but the force exerting pressure from above. The T-Rex ultimately secured this war of time, though the cost was the endurance of millions of years of evolution. Yet if Siats functioned as a phantom of the past, the subsequent opponent existed as a ghost lurking within the T-Rex's own era, a menace originating not from the terrestrial plains, but from the depths of the riverbed, where sunlight refuses to penetrate. On the solid earth beneath a brilliant sun, the Tyrannosaurus Rex remained the undisputed monarch. No creature dared meet its gaze. Nevertheless, the authority of the T-Rex was geographically constrained. At the water's threshold, where the landscape transitions into the river, exists a border invisible to the eye, and across this threshold, a different king holds court. This monarch requires no crown or vocal display. It relies solely on absolute, predatory silence. This is Deinosuchus, the terrible crocodile. Discard any comparison to the saltwater or Nile crocodiles of the present day. Deinosuchus was a true behemoth, birthed from the most primordial nightmares. Reaching lengths of 10 to 12 meters and boasting a mass of 8 tons. It equaled or surpassed an adult T-Rex, most terrifying of all. These creatures inhabited the same ecosystem as apex predators, like Alamosaurus, Albertosaurus, and the T-Rex. Deinosuchus did not waste energy roaming for quarry. It permitted the quarry to approach. Imagine a sweltering afternoon in the coastal marshlands. A T-Rex, exhausted from a fruitless hunt, approaches the bank to satisfy its parched throat. Even a king cannot ignore the call of thirst. It observes the placid water. Where a handful of rotting logs float listlessly, the T-Rex lowers its massive cranium. This represents the most precarious instant in any animal's existence. Vision is restricted. The nostrils are submerged, and most crucially, the throat of fatal vulnerability is completely exposed. In a split second, the water's surface erupts. The log suddenly reveals its eyes, a colossal maw, 2 meters wide and bristling with banana-sized teeth, launches from the depths with the velocity of a projectile. It is the bite of doom. Scientists estimate that the bite force of Deinosuchus approached 100,000 newtons, nearly doubling the 57,000 newton force of the T-Rex. This power was sufficient to pulverize the shell of a sea turtle as easily as one might crush a berry. Had such a bite connected with the head of the Dinosaur King, the skull would have shattered instantly. Should the neck or a limb have been caught, the predator would have engaged in its signature death roll, instantly drowning the victim or tearing the extremity free. This is no mere fantasy. The fossilized record confirms it. Leg bones and tail vertebrae of tyrannosaurs have been recovered bearing the distinctive, deep gouged tooth imprints of Deinosuchus, serving as permanent, scarred reminders of these encounters. While killing and consuming a healthy adult T-Rex would have remained a formidable challenge for even this crocodile, the Tyrannosaur was frequently forced to retreat with life-altering injuries. Nonetheless, it could effortlessly pulverize a tibia, leaving the dinosaur sovereign crippled. More terrifyingly, they specialized in ambushing juvenile T-Rexes that displayed the recklessness to linger near the riverbank. Deinosuchus stands as a grim reminder that within the natural order, true security is an illusion for any monarch. The threshold separating hunter from quarry is occasionally bridged by a solitary step into the surf. While the T-Rex may have presided over the terrestrial realm, the Deinosuchus reigned as the undisputed master of that watery perimeter. However, if all the previously mentioned adversaries, from the Ankylosaurus and Triceratops to the Deinosuchus, were merely external rivals of distinct species, the terminal antagonist remains the most harrowing and brutal of all the T-Rex's own reflection. The bloodiest conflicts were not waged against the world at large, but consisted of internal struggles for the right to occupy the summit of the hierarchy. What entity possessed the capacity to vanquish a Tyrannosaurus Rex? A Triceratops could impale its lungs. An Ankylosaurus could shatter its limbs. A Deinosuchus could crush its bones, yet, to definitively and utterly subdue a 9-ton engine of aggression, fueled by peak intelligence and power, only one answer suffices. Another T-Rex, the most hazardous, savage, and sanguinary rival of the dinosaur sovereign, was, ironically, its own kin. This is no mere conjecture. It is substantiated by fossilized trauma. Consider the cranium of Sue, the most celebrated and complete T-Rex skeleton currently exhibited at Chicago's Field Museum. Her mandible is riddled with perforations, while these were once attributed to parasitic disease. Contemporary forensic investigations have unveiled a more chilling reality. These are the dental signatures of a competing T-Rex. We define this as face-biting behavior within the hierarchy of apex predators. When two tyrannosaurs vied for mating rights or territorial sovereignty, they seldom initiated an immediate, lethal engagement. Instead, threat rituals were performed, roars were exchanged, displays of raw power were executed, and faces were bitten to assert dominance. Occasionally, however, these skirmishes transcended ritualistic boundaries, devolving into genuine fights to the death. Picture the Earth shuddering as two titans, possessing a combined mass of 20 tons, slam into one another at 30 kilometers per hour. The reverberations of snapping fangs, colliding bone, and deafening, guttural bellows would have saturated the valley. In such an arena, mercy held no currency. A singular, well-placed bite to the throat would conclude the engagement. A skull-shattering collision against the ribs would decimate vital organs. The vanquished would remain entombed upon the battlefield forever. The tragedy of the Tyrannosaur lineage did not conclude with power struggles. However, the reality was even more gruesome. In 2010, the paleontologist Nicholas Longrich unveiled a startling discovery. Upon the arm and toe bones of a T-Rex specimen, he identified deep, characteristic U-shaped dental impressions. What creature could leave such massive, forceful marks? Only another T-Rex. Crucially, these wounds exhibited no signs of biological regeneration, confirming they were inflicted post-mortem. The inevitable conclusion is undeniable. The T-Rex practiced cannibalism. Yes, the dinosaur sovereign was a cannibal. Within the unforgiving landscape of the late Cretaceous, where resources were rarely guaranteed, a carcass was viewed simply as a carcass, be it a Triceratops or a member of its own tribe, whether a juvenile that had lost its way, an elderly individual, or a warrior debilitated by combat. All were subject to being consumed by their peers. The spectacle of a T-Rex rending the flesh of another serves as nature's most visceral icon, stripping away any romanticized notion of kingship. It highlights the profound isolation inherent in occupying the apex of the food chain. There is no kinship, and no clemency, only the relentless imperative to endure. The sovereign's greatest enemy was a mirror image of itself, whether faced with an Ankylosaurus, a Triceratops, a Deinosuchus, a Siats, or its own kind. The T-Rex confronted them all. The interlacing scars adorning the skeletons of Stan, Scotty, or Sue are not badges of failure. They are medals of survival. They survived piercing horns, collapsed lungs, mace-like tail strikes, and the pulverized wreckage inflicted by enemy jaws. Sovereignty was achieved, not because the T-Rex was invulnerable, but because it steadfastly refused to succumb to the shadow of death. Ultimately, history has validated a singular truth: no terrestrial entity possessed the power to permanently defeat the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Only a catastrophic, extraplanetary force and intervention exceeding all known biological laws could finally vacate the throne. That, however, is a separate chapter. Although the T-Rex vanished 66 million years ago, its roar continues to reverberate within our consciousness, acting as an eternal reminder of an era when true behemoths stalked our world.